Good morning and welcome to Answer a Broadsheet Reader. My name is John Ryan. I'm with Broadsheet. I'm with my glamorous assistant, celebrity accountant, Vanessa Foran. Good morning, Vanessa.
Morning, everyone.
And in the hot stool of doom this morning is Ivor Cummins. Good morning, Ivor.
Good morning, John. Hi, Vanessa.
Good morning, Ivor. The Fat Emperor. Do we refer to you as the Fat Emperor or Ivor?
No, Ivor's fine. Yeah, that was just anyway, we won't waste time explaining that term.
Just to give a brief bio of Ivor. Ivor Cummins. What age are you, Ivor?
I'm 51.
51.
Oh, you're the baby of the panel.
And Ivor, you're a Dubliner?
Yeah, Dublin, yeah.
And your qualifications are extensive, but they are to deal with problem solving, data analysis. You've been researching chronic illness for since 2012, and you're not actually dealing with patients as such, but you're looking at a lot of the available data. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I was a biochemical engineer originally back in 1990. I've done Stanford courses and other stuff. Yeah. But the main thing, I'm a chartered engineer. So I came top 6 in 500 back in 2015 for Chartered Engineer of the Year. So there's all that kind of more academic stuff. But the main thing is I've spent 30 years in complex problem solving, team leadership and corporate. And in the last 2 years, I was master technologist. So kind of senior section level, sometimes running teams of up to 100 engineers across a few countries in the world on $100 million type issues, complex technical issues. So that's my background. That enabled me in 12 to get into the metabolic stuff because I had some personal health issues. But since then, I've got a network of hundreds of professors and doctors, specialists, consultants, all specialties all over the world in my personal network. So I've been working for 8 years with these guys and researchers and publishing a book and many, many lectures.
So, and you also deal with diet, which is the book, Eat Rich, Live Longer.
Eat Rich, Live Long. Yeah, we published a couple of years ago, myself and Dr. Jeffrey Gerber, who's a fellow of the American Family Practitioners. And yeah, he's had similar views for the last 20 years on a lower carb, low processed food diet for metabolic health and fixing type 2 diabetes. So yeah.
Okay, Ivor, and then at the beginning of the pandemic, of the COVID, let's say back in March, you were a very early critic of the response, and I would imagine not just in Ireland but worldwide.
Yeah, I was an early supporter of some aspects. I suppose the key thing is my motivations. People often wonder what people's motivations are. So obviously I wasn't being paid for COVID. I'm in metabolic health, and a lot of people were disappointed when I started focusing on this. Tough. So two motivations. One, for 30 years, I've stood for technical truth. So I've always gotten really angry when technical truth was twisted for some other motivation, even though I'll accept lying, and I was a manager for many years, so I've manipulated people, but technical truth is sacred to me. So that's one thing. That's what's driven me crazy on COVID. And the other thing is I have 5 children, so I'm very future looking for the next generation. And it's appalled me how we're destroying our societal norms, freedoms, based on very bad science, I would say. Okay. So they're the motivations. So I began to get drawn into COVID for that reason. I supported masks over lockdown back in March because I knew lockdown from the science would not yield much benefit. And then when the lockdown continued and continued and continued, I became more and more entrained because I became less and less believing in what was occurring. So that's my motivation, and yeah.
Okay. Okay, well, Vanessa is going to get the questions from Broadsheet readers. They asked us questions all day yesterday. Not all of them warm and positive, and but there are quite a good. There's a good few ones. There's a bunch at the start. It becomes a kind of its own dialogue, its own thread. So we'll just start with Vanessa. Art Vandelays.
Yep. You're going to see Art Vandelay here now.
This is the first comment. The question for Ivor. You mentioned on the Twitter machine that 200 doctors in Ireland and 200 doctors in Belgium think that the COVID pandemic is nothing more than hysteria. I think you'll accept that this is still a minuscule amount of in the grand scheme of things. So on that basis, a few questions. What do you think the number of doctors, experts has to get in order for it to become the new accepted way forward?
Okay, so yeah, there's 200, as you saw there in Belgium. There's 650 in a group in Germany and growing. And I think there's 800, a group of 800 in the Netherlands. And there's an Ontario, Canada group as well. So there's groups all over the world, but they're always a couple of hundred or something like that. And the reason is, of course, because to take an unorthodox position in this is very dangerous. And we've seen that, we've seen doctors losing their jobs in America. And, it's a very fraught situation. So to give an example, in Ireland, there's a large group of doctors numbering a couple of hundred, and one of their lead people has assured me that the majority would agree entirely with the letter we put together. So not saying it's hysteria by any means, but putting the data in context.
Okay.
And I've many, many more outside of that, but none of them will actually be named.
No.
Because we saw the other day, Feely got fired, go figure. So I think there's a huge, larger number behind the scenes, not even willing to talk or engage privately. What number would it need to get to? That's a very hard question. They usually say tipping point is 10% of people. So when 10% of medical people or specialists are kind of saying something, it begins to tip the balance. But I don't think we're near there yet.
And we may not know it because of what happens to Feely and Dr. De Bruin. Okay. And Vanessa, there was the second question on there as well.
What do you think the number of doctors, experts has to get to in order for it to become the new accepted way forward?
Yeah, I kind of answered that. 10% is a psychological tipping point in many things, but this is a tough one because there's an enormous machine, obviously, running the narrative. No conspiracy, it's just the way it is. And it makes it very difficult for people to speak up, obviously.
Okay. Do we have the second question?
For most forms of medical advice, we take the majority opinion for what the best thing to do is. Why do you think that this time is different and that we shouldn't take it from the doctor and medical profession point of view, I mean?
Okay, yeah, well, there's a bit of a conspiracy theorist flavor coming in here. So anyway, that's always amusing. So the reality is that many doctor friends of mine are saying the irony is this is not really a classic medical question. So I've been assured by many GPs and higher level specialists that the GPs really don't know much about this because it's a data integration question. So it's kind of virology, it's epidemiology, it's mathematics, it's logic, it's immunology. And the reality is most doctors are GPs or they're specialists in their individual area. And putting together and integrating an enormous complex picture like this is a data problem. So what we're seeing all over the world is like my new friend, Professor Michael Levitt, who won the Nobel Prize for chemical and biochemical mathematical modeling. He's been a leader in our side since January because he can do the data and he understands how these systems work. The problem is the vast majority of doctors, they're not actually specialized in what I just described. And that's a big reason why we've seen what we've seen. Why are we seeing what we're seeing? I guess there are very large worldwide organizations with huge influence, like we've seen, it's open, the WHO, and there are others, the WEF, and even UN elements. There is an alignment behind this being a catastrophe that needs many measures to deal with it long term. And that alignment is kind of pan-international. So the governments, again, politicians and academics, to my point about the doctors, can they put together and integrate a full picture? Well, they don't seem to be able to. And the guidance is kind of coming from above. So there's a consistency. And then final point, you can add in as well, America, the intense political situation, Trump versus anti-Trump and the election. That's also fueling an enormous amount of tension. So I just think there's a lot of worldwide vectors acting on this. It's not an ordinary kind of epidemic.
No.
It's become something much, much bigger.
Vanessa, we have that third.
Yeah.
Do you think that by referring to people as sheeple, donkeys, stupid, they'll find it very hard to listen and possibly change their minds and agree with you?
Yeah, well, old dog, new tricks, it's tough. So I've been 8 years out there and I've been fighting people on metabolism, on efficacy of certain drug classes, like, lowering cholesterol. And I am always cheeky and irreverent, and I have a long, hard corporate career behind me. So I can do the whole nice thing. I can do very, tactical. I can do very diplomatic. But that's just my persona out there. So yeah, in Corona, my frustration building since May has led me to be quite harsh in some instances. Um, and you probably lose some people, but I think in many cases you lose people who are lost anyway. So usually in general I engage, but if something gets silly, I'll sometimes kind of go that direction. And sometimes late at night, with a glass of wine or two, I can be a little harsh. But
Yeah, so can Vanessa, actually.
I'm impressed you drink wine. I thought you'd be,
red wine.
On
Great
peanuts and.
Okay,
My 2 cents.
centralized body. I kind of spoke to that already. So centralized bodies, there's no question and there's no secret here. Of course, centralized bodies like the WHO are essentially leading this. Their edicts have been transferred into action in countries all over the world kind of yesterday. So yeah, that's a fact. Is there a danger? Of course there is, because they're not elected representatives. So they've got, in general, huge industry funding and corporate interactions broadly. They're not elected bodies. So the governments of the world that have sovereignty and take action for their own people on behalf of their people, obviously you bypass that whole democratic system when you hand the baton over to a worldwide international organization which has funding from many sources. So it's just a reality. It's a more corporatized society when you do that. And I mentioned the World Economic Forum. I won't get into that, but a very fascinating group that have been working for a long time. They absolutely are in love with COVID, are very pro-hysteria, and have declared that it has been their goal for the Great Reset to go to a climate-focused, kind of more universal world of universal IDs and all this kind of stuff, which is fine. That's their goal. But, it's not really your old-fashioned sovereign democratic countries doing what's best for their people anymore. So no conspiracy here. I'm sure most people understand the reality of the corporatocracy over the last 20 years that's broadly built up. So it's an extension of that. I think that's a very fair thing to observe.
Okay, do you see the chain of command as WHO, NFET, and then Leo and MEO?
In the case of Ireland, broadly speaking, I would guess that from the early days, NFET, the bureaucrats would be linking strongly in with WHO. So as well as the public announcements, I would be pretty certain that all along there are interactions there. And then the government look 100% to NFET. So there's your next line in the chain. And politicians, of course. You don't go into politics because you're of a technical nature, shall we say. So politicians are going to be utterly lost, generally. Not a criticism, but let's be honest, I've been a manager for 15 years. Certain professions weed out the more highly technical people. So they're just going to follow blindly. And maybe added to that, there's political ends that are very tempting. So if there's a crisis, people are not worried about all the other stuff. If there's a crisis, you can write off a big deficit. If there's a crisis, you can control much easier. Like
also,
last week, I couldn't believe it last week. I actually was looking at this in an Irish newspaper. Could have been the Times. And one of the politicians flew a kite or put a flag up the flagpole to test the water and talked about banning demonstrations. Okay then, 2020. Yeah. I'm reading this in an Irish paper. Who'd have thought a few months ago? There you go.
Yeah, I know. That was Simon Coveney. To his credit, Micheál Martin said that they weren't going to.
Hey, thanks, Leo.
Wow,
that's great.
The real Taoiseach, not the acting Taoiseach.
Well, the day when you're thanking a politician for saying that is a very sorry day, because it should never have to be said. Yeah. Anyway, there you go. Just my thoughts.
Three-parter here for you guys.
Okay. Ivor explained the science behind Luke O'Neill's bat poo crazy theory that masks are like vaccines. That's from Just Saying.
Yep. Well, there's another rude person. Bat poo crazy. That's worse than donkey, maybe. So yeah, you can make a technical argument about nearly anything if it's a mechanistic argument. For instance, you can make an argument about masks by looking at laser differential droplets, maps from someone breathing. But that's just mechanistic, hypothetical stuff. So you could make that argument. Now, interestingly, I was making the argument a few days before, and I often wonder how many people are reading me or watching me. I was making the argument that if you put in masks and suppression all summer after an epidemic has waned, like all before it, like this one did, it was very impactful, very sad, especially elderly and infirm, but it waned. And then you bring in suppression measures, like, for instance, masks as an example, and you try and limit spread. Well, the problem is that during the summer, coronaviruses are always present at a few percent. We have that from Glasgow and many other studies. And in the winter, they're present at a higher level. So during the summer, what you would want when an epidemic wanes is open, free evolutionary interaction during the summer period, because there's very low impacts, ICU or mortality. And then you'll gain more immunity. So in a sense, he's saying that kind of thing, but because he loves masks for his own reasons, I guess, he wants to give a kind of a halo effect to masks, that they're doing what I said, but you're wearing a mask and letting out a bit of virus. So I find it hilarious, because I would say, do what you're saying, but just take off the mask bit, because we're in the summer and this is a coronavirus, one of a long family. But I guess he's found another way to promote masks. So there you go. Okay, presumably you're further down the road to community immunity than might be expected. How might we benchmark this? So yeah, the person says it's pointless to look for antibodies, and it is kind of pointless. Nothing's ever completely pointless. But we know that in countries where this has passed through openly almost through the population, like for example, Sweden, they might be showing around 10% antibodies. But the problem is, if you take a large group of people who have been corona or COVID, SARS-CoV-2 has got into them, you've got layers of immune system that can deal with it. So there's mucosal immune system, there's IgA antibodies, there's an innate immune system. All our mucous layers can just blow away the virus in healthy people. And then you get all the way back to T cell immunity. And the T cells can also deal with the problem, recognizing proteins from prior coronaviruses, because they're all similar. And so you've got all these layers of the immune system that can knock out the problem before you get to developing actual antibody, IgG, that is generated for long-term immunity as well. So in short, if you just look for one specific type of antibody, depending on the assay you use, you're going to see a small section of the people who got this and were finished with it and blew it away and were immune. So they're grossly undercounting the amount of exposure by using antibody test results. You would have to use T cell assays and many other mechanisms. But just to come back to what I said about Sweden, Sweden has gone through the classic Gompertz curve of mortality, up, down. A couple of months ago, they were clear of this. Now they have nearly no ICU or mortality. So they've gone through the whole population, and their effective herd immunity threshold, the people would have heard about herd immunity, is maybe around 10 or 15%. So experts all over the world, not getting publicized, but Professor Sunetra Gupta from Oxford University, right, mathematical epidemiologist of the highest standing, she said this back in April. And she's been saying it since, and many others. You need to get around 10 or 20% maybe antibodies, and a population has broadly passed this.
Yeah.
But we're not hearing that, of course, because the message is we haven't passed this. It's still there. It's as bad as it was in March. That's insane. I mean, people are actually saying that in Ireland, we're not much different than we were in March. After it's passed through the population, It's gone down to effectively zero for months in Ireland by itself. And people are saying we're somehow like we were in March after the susceptible had passed largely. So I don't know, it's just anti-science to me.
And yeah, the Sweden model, which you cite, the official position on Sweden is that, well, we don't know yet.
Okay, I can answer that very simply, because the beauty of Sweden is it's pure raw data. There's no opinion needed. So I've heard the narrative. It's hilarious if it wasn't so tragic. The reality is that Sweden had most of its deaths in Stockholm area. It's high density. So people think it's low density country. It's not. They're all down the south, and the Stockholm county and town was where 60 something percent of the deaths came from. There were 70% from care home scenarios, around 50% care homes, around 20% care at home. So there's some of the facts. They had 560 deaths per million people in the country. We had 360, approximately. If you correct for the factors that made Sweden worse, they're around the same as Ireland, and they're not as bad as England. This is the reality. Their ICU and their mortality now is on the floor. They're opening up to crowds of 500. And even during the epidemic, they had no lockdown, as people know, and they had no masks. They still have no masks. So they are the perfect control country for Europe, and are pretty much same engineering level impact as Ireland and England. Completely different strategy. So they proved the fact of what we've been saying for months. There's 5 published papers now analyzing lockdown from universities all over the world. They all say the same thing. Lockdown had a minimal effect, and a tiny effect on the actual outcome.
And yet a devastating effect on the economy here. I mean,
oh, here it comes.
There you go.
Phil writes, what causes rheumatoid arthritis or auto-inflammatory disease, and are we seeing or likely to see a lot more of it since COVID?
Right, so RA, auto-inflammatory, we have an increase in autoimmune disease, and auto-inflammatory the last 30 years, and a lot of it is just kind of poor quality processed foods and people reacting to elements, the proteins in foods that we wouldn't have traditionally eaten, and therefore our immune system can recognize them as an invader. Yada yada. The classic case is celiac disease. 1% of people will die if they eat wheat, chronically. 1 in 100. And that gives an example of a problem. SARS-CoV-2 acts in interesting ways, but is broadly not completely different than prior. You get a cytokine storm where your immune system overreacts to the invader at a certain stage, and it's the shotgun, machine gun of your immune system attacking that actually damages your body and in a sense essentially kills you. So there are many autoimmune diseases, and this could conceivably, aggravate long-term, but to be honest, we don't really have data on that yet. There's a lot of talk of long-term effects from SARS-CoV-2, but I've been interested to note that in 7 or 8 months, there's been thousands of published papers on every scary aspect of SARS-CoV-2, but nothing credible on long-term. So I think at 8 months now, they would have had that data. So it's possible there'll be long-term sequelae of this, but maybe not much different than bad influenzas, which are similar, or shingles, or many viral infections have long-term sequelae with immune system, effects that they've had. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to pretend what sequelae is.
Oh, sorry, it's the follow-on impacts of a disease state. So you get a flu, you cough, then you feel a bit better, but you're tired for 7 or 8 weeks, or yeah.
Okay. Vanessa,
yes, you're going on to Madam X there now.
A very fundamental question. If we follow this alternative strategy and the hospitals fill both ICUs and wards, and normal treatments have to be abandoned, including cancer treatments, what bright plan has he, Ivor, to stop this and frontline staff from being worked to the ground?
Okay, well, yes. So we went through the epidemic, and the impact was in late March and into April for a couple of weeks. The peak in England turned over on the 11th of April, and Ireland was not too dissimilar. And then we saw the loading going down. So for a few weeks in late March, April, there was a very big impact with, median age 84 years of age, average age 82, obviously a specific cohort mostly affected, and it caused a lot of tension. So great kudos to the workers who had to go through the tough period. But that kind of ended towards the end of April, the tough period. So the impact on cancer diagnoses that the preventions is enormous, but it's not really due to the couple of weeks where there was an impact. I mentioned Gompertz curve in Northern Europe.
Yeah.
You get this peak, very impactful for a few weeks, and then you're down where you can handle it. And we saw that in Ireland and England and everywhere. The problem is then we've had several months of impact to hospital capacity, society, economy, and everything. But that's not to do with having a surge in the hospital. That was back in, early May. Now it's September. So I'd suggest to that person, why have we impacted the whole system and delayed so many cancer diagnoses and everything else and disastrous impacts for the last 4 or 5 months after a seasonal virus had passed? And I'd say what's more, that yes, coming into the fall and winter now, we know from the research of the past 30 years that coronaviruses will increase in prevalence. Now, this one shouldn't be as impactful anymore because the susceptible have largely passed, sadly. And there is more community immunity, but there will be some impact. And if we, for instance, in 2020-21 have an excess mortality winter, the same as 2017 or 18, we're going to see a substantial hump of excess mortality. And a lot of people, because it's endemic, will be carrying SARS-CoV-2. So yes, you could say, woo, we're getting a second wave. Or you could say, well, we're experiencing something we've experienced for the last 20 or 30 years. Now that the first wave, the impactful one, has passed, the first wave was the problem. It always is with a new virus. So I'm not sure what to say to the person. We need to run our hospitals efficiently, as always. In 2018, in January in the UK, we have 45,000 excess mortality with COVID in the UK from this.
Yeah.
In January 2018, in the newspapers, there was 20,000 excess deaths over December. 18 was a really bad flu year.
Yeah.
So the UK had many hospitals overpressured. But no one said anything. So we've got to say, as a society, is it now every winter season when there's excess deaths from influenza A, B, from other pathogens, from SARS-CoV-2 when it's endemic? Are we changing our whole world now? And who made that decision? Exactly where? Trace back to it. In April 2020, we said we'd flatten the curve and we'd make sure the hospitals were not overrun. We did it by later in April. But what happened to that strategy? To be honest, I think that was a good strategy and I think we achieved it. What happened since?
Are Sweden expecting a second wave, or did they even get a first wave? Do they regard it as a first wave?
Well, Sweden are the de facto experts in epidemiological strategy for epidemics at this stage. They've got the gold star. There's no question about that. And Giseki, their man behind the throne, behind Anders Tegnell, has now been offered the top job in WHO in infectious disease spread management or some top department. So that's a given. So anyone who believes the stuff in the newspapers about Sweden is deluded, right? And I'll send you a clip afterwards to a video made by CNN in mid-May in Sweden and Stockholm. And you would not believe how normal it was at the height of the epidemic. But they distanced and did hygiene, 70-year-olds plus keep away and work from home when possible and stay in home when you're sick. They're the exact WHO guidelines for pandemics. WHO guidelines, I have them on my hard drive, 2019, November, I think. No lockdowns, no masks. That was in the WHO guidelines in November.
Yeah.
So Sweden simply followed the WHO guidelines right up to last year.
Okay.
Everything changed. Sweden said, no, we're following the science. So sorry, your question, John, you're asking about Sweden specifically.
It was just basically, are they going to get a second wave? Did they even get a first wave?
Okay. So the answer is they followed the science, and the science would say, and I've interviewed doctors, professors in England, all over the world, that there should not be a second wave worthy of the name. So the second wave terminology comes from the 1918 flu. And that second wave that happened in autumn out of season was very impactful. But it's largely agreed now that there were two different viruses for those two waves, because the second wave hit the young and it did not hit the elderly like the first wave. And there's several other facts around that. It's a 100-year-old murky history. We have no biological data from it. And it's broadly agreed that it was a second virus. We're not expecting a second virus, right?
Okay.
Neither are Sweden. They're expecting SARS-CoV-2 to become endemic into the winter. And in the winter, human immune system falls in function, well established, and we get more susceptible people. So 8-9 months later in the winter period, where you've got temperature, humidity ideal for virus, and you've got immunity down, you've also built up another group of people who are more ill, more aged, and sadly, they will be exposed again. And that's why we see these respiratory season increase in excess mortality forever going into the past,
Okay.
you know?
Okay.
So
Okay.
they'll expect, like Spain is seeing in the south now, and France is seeing increases in ICU and some mortalities with SARS-CoV-2. You're going to see that going through the winter. But the big question is that abnormal? Is that a second wave or not? I think Sweden think there could be what I described, and they're comfortable. They've done the right thing. They've managed it and kept their whole society optimized for health and
Okay,
not destroyed it.
Speaking of which, when just saying as when Dublin wet pubs reopen, which pubs will you be drinking in so I can buy him a pint? What's
I
your
don't
local?
actually go. With 5 kids and my fondness for wine, I don't go out much anymore. We're all too busy. But what pubs? Let me think now. I suppose the Morgue in Temple Oak. You know, that's an occasional one.
Okay.
Or in Rathgar, what's that one called? Not the 101, but beside it, Bottler's Bank. Maybe Bottler's Bank.
Bank. Okay. Well, better sounding.
You're Southsider anyway.
Better sounding than the Morgue.
Yeah, well, that's the Temple Oak Inn. Sorry for people who don't know. It has an Undertaker's and it's always been called the Morgue.
I'm going to... Why do Taiwanese wear masks if they are a waste of time? Please explain their total of 7 deaths.
Yeah, so the masks have been worn basically for pollution reasons in the East for decades. We know this. You've seen, you know, kind of Asian tourists and all with masks, even over in Europe walking around. So that was the original reason. And also they've got hit with a lot of influenzas early on because of the origins of many of these new viruses. So they wear them and they believe in them. The problem is black swans. So in engineering complex problem solving, you always need to look at black swans, the exceptions to the rule, comparisons. So we have countries who do not wear masks who have vanishingly low rates. Let's just say very low rates of mortality. And we have countries that have worn masks, many of them from way back. I think Peru and Chile, or might be Argentina. Sorry, I can't remember all of them, who put in hard mask mandates and mandatory lockdowns with army involvement, right? I think that was Peru. We have endless countries that hammer down masks harder than the Asians. And they now seasonally, later than Europe, because I won't get into the science, but the virome rises seasonally. They now have some of the highest death rates in the world. So the lockdowns we're in, the masks we're in, made no difference. So associational data is very dangerous. I see guys who wear masks and I see guys who did not get impacted. Therefore, I say masks stopped impact. Well, no, because we have too many black swans. All the countries wearing masks where they're enormously impacted. So masks may assist. The science up until May 2020, including a CDC report of many control trials and studies on masks in May 2020 was published. Right up for the last 40 years up till then, the answer was masks don't really help with viral transmission because, you know, the virome, the viruses are tiny. They move in and out through all the gaps in the mask. So that was the science. In May, June 2020, we had a rapid few papers of studies that said they do help. And I put 40 years of science ahead of, you know, a few weeks of new science, especially when there's such a powerful narrative going on. You know, people might be a little bit biased. But if you know, they may have some efficacy, but to think of them as a golden nugget, you know, is just kind of crazy. They may have some efficacy. And in a rising epidemic, I was pushing masks back in March, believe it or not. I have the
Were you?
videos. I have
Were
the
you
videos.
really?
I
Yeah.
was pushing masks big time. I can send you my video links, several of them. And I love the Taiwan study where they showed the laser interferometry, showing the vapor and the particles. I was pushing masks like hell in March, April. The problem is when the epidemic ends, you need to pull back from that stuff, like I mentioned in the summer. But they put in mandatory masks in July.
Yeah.
Where's the science, guys? And Sweden, Tegnell, made it very clear months ago. No masks in Sweden. They may promote bugs, bad hygiene. They're ineffective, say the science. We're not having them in Sweden. He's not a stupid guy because, as I said, Sweden are the gold standard for societal minimal impact to your whole society health. They said, and they did it. They did it.
Yeah.
And I'll just say, well, that happens to be his opinion as well. And Gisecki, the WHO guy.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is so contentious. We can't.
Yeah.
It's not even allowed to be discussed on RTE. A couple of days ago, a possible discussion was cancelled. I mean, anyway,
look,
we
to
ran.
be honest,
Sorry.
Yeah, I think the pro-mask people, and I don't really get involved in the mask thing anymore because, like you say, it's got like Trump, anti-Trump. So when science has gone out the door and discussion of data and science, and it's not allowed anymore, well, then you either fight that or you just walk away from it. But it is absurd you're not allowed to discuss science. But the problem with that program, and I did hear about it, there's no way I would have gone on it because there's nothing people who want to drive masks and mandatory restrictions and draconian measures would like more than to have a program with a bunch of screaming nutters, maybe, turning up and being anti-mask. And then you can say, oh, look, anti-mask people are nutters or they're right-wing. And I wouldn't feed into that. You know, I mentioned Anders Tegnell, the hero of Sweden, who did an incredible job managing this epidemic, world-beating. And that's being acknowledged by the WHO now and the Wall Street Journal, and many newspapers are admitting now they did a class job in the end. Just like Tegnell said, judge me at the end. He was right. So Tegnell says no masks, and Gisecki, who's top world leader, who is advising him, who's now been put on this top WHO panel leading it, is also of the same opinion. So if anyone wants to go and say, oh, they're nutters who are anti-mask, sorry, some of the smartest people in the world in this field would not be anti-mask, but Professor Carl Hennigan of Oxford University Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine went into our Doyle, the Oireachtas, and said clearly, if you want to put in mandatory masks, that's a decision you can do, but you cannot say it's evidence-based because it's not evidence-based. It may help, but you are working off non-evidence-based decision-making. And he's professor in Oxford. So anyone out there who thinks it's wackos, sorry, I'm 30 years in science. I may not be correct, but the science on masks is so woolly as to the point that you couldn't really deploy laws based on it. It wouldn't make sense, as Hennigan said. That's a fact. Now, if you want to believe in them, fine, go for it. Knock yourself out.
Well, Ivor, thank you very much for joining us. I mean, I think the vast majority of our readership are pro-mask and would be mask wearers, but
fine.
Yeah, I mean, and visually, when you look around, I mean, most people are wearing masks. I mean, it is.
I would only say, John, again, without being arrogant, because I've been very clear on the type of leaders who would agree that the science is extremely poor. Not saying that there's no justification. But the fact is, the vast majority of people nowadays, there's no way they can get into reading scientific papers on masks or on anything. Let's be honest about it.
Yeah,
so you have to ask yourself why you're doing it. It may be for goodwill. It may help someone, which is great. It may be because you really believe it will protect you. That's great. It may be because you don't realize the epidemic's past and the time for masks will be in next winter when there's real impacts going on. There may be many reasons you want, or maybe you just read the newspapers.
Yeah.
And you just think it must be true.
And you haven't heard a contrary opinion, I mean, regarding the masks.
if you've heard that's the mushroom phenomenon. If you only hear one thing all the time and it's strident and powerful, like masks are crucial, and you don't ever hear the alternative because it's not allowed in the media, I don't blame people for believing it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you're silly. To the earlier point, you're not saying you're a donkey. I have repeatedly told people in my scientific community when they get really angry, in fairness to the ordinary people, they've had a fire hose torrent of essentially propaganda, as Professor John Lee in England I interviewed 3 months ago. He said, this has essentially been propaganda, because propaganda is when you reinforce a story we know, and that's been happening since March. Investigative journalism is when you challenge a story that's widespread accepted. So we've lost investigative journalism. So the people, it's not really their fault. They hear a torrent.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's why I think, referring to the earlier question, people aren't sheeple. They're not. I mean, if you're being fed a certain narrative, and as you say, it's continuous, and it's every day. And if you're just watching the mainstream, you couldn't come to any other conclusion. Ivor, I just want to say thank you very much. Sorry, we've really run out of time. We're way over the time. I want to apologise for the lag in the questions. We've tons more questions for you, Ivor. If maybe you want to come back in a week or two, and we can go through them. Sorry, over to you, Vanessa. What do you?
Oh, sorry, I was just lining up. Your biggest fan is a broadsheeter called Same Old Queen SOQ. And I just feel we should get his questions answered, because he has been introducing your sort of thoughts on this since the start of the pandemic and lockdown to broadsheet readers.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can see them here. So Sweden's back to normality. You bet. I mean, Sweden is completely, effectively back to normality. But I will send a link to the video of mid-May CNN did with their reporters. People will be fascinated, so I'll send that. Best lockdown strategy for Ireland. Well, mine back in the end of April, and I haven't changed it. It would have been end of April. As the curve comes down, we know the trajectory will keep falling. So we know in the UK that the pubs all opened back in June, 10 weeks ago. No masks, and I was there in London, minimal distancing. 10 weeks with maybe several 100 million human interactions across the 50,000 pubs of London, all over UK. And we know the debt kept falling. So we know the Gompertz keeps falling. So back in April, May, Ireland should have pulled back all the restrictions, because the curve was inevitably going to fall and stay low all summer. And then maybe if ICU and hospitalization and real measures of epidemic potential began to rise significantly more than previous years in late 20, then you could maybe start bringing in measures. So obviously that's not what happened in Ireland. So Sweden are doing what I said, but then again, I was agreed with Sweden from the very start. And now that they've done the best job in the world, I still agree with them. The third question, maybe it's too late. I just wanted to get the pub point in England, because people have to realize there's empirical scientific proof of what I'm saying in the actual data and publications, right? So I only go with the science. This stuff's published. It's facts. Nothing to do with belief systems. So is your opinion COVID has followed a seasonal pattern? No question. Seasonal pattern all over the world. I've done presentations on YouTube on this. The book of Hope Simpson, a doctor who in 1933 set up the UK's first influenza-like transmission laboratory in the west of England, spent 52 years studying flu and wrote a book. And I can send a link to the PDF. And you would not believe what's in it. But yes, COVID, you have got in Northern Europe a sharp Gompertz March, April. And you've got then in the South Tropical, like Brazil, Peru, a long, slow rise and peaking around like June, July. Completely different. But guess what? SARS-CoV-2 was identified in Brazil in November 2019 in human sewage. Same in Spain, same in Europe. And you get completely different curves of impact. So,
did you believe, that sounded a bit dodgy, the Barcelona sewage.
No, just to clarify, the sewage in Barcelona claimed possibly March 19, and that was based on a single sample. But the November 19, no question,
No
and that's
question.
been repeated. We've even got the first, in the UK, we had the first victim now, was December 19. So there's no question in November 19, the virome is massively capable of moving, and it washed across Europe. But
Yeah,
there's
many
a
people.
dormancy too, without getting into detail.
Sure.
You read Hope Simpson, there's dormancy aspects to this when it comes into a population, and then it rises. So that's complex.
Okay. Vanessa, there was a last question there, just if you can.
Well, yeah, it was. Yeah, it was just about the media from Same Old Q again. Just about the media, and I think you've done that already. But if I was to snap, you've provided a huge amount of depth to the answers, more than I think readers were expecting, to be honest. Would you agree, John?
Oh, it's going to be very good. Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch more questions, Ivor. It'd be great to get you back maybe in a couple of weeks. Would that be okay?
Well, any chance I can get to share science data in our world of media kind of spin and weird narratives, whatever reason you give for the narratives, you know, that gets into conspiracy theories, but I ignore that. But yeah, real data, the more we share it, the better, and openly. And it maintains a free society too, because we've seen a lot of censorship from YouTube. We've seen top leaders in epidemiology taken off YouTube simply for saying unpopular things. And you know what? They were correct. They were correct. So back in March, April, the people who were actually taken off YouTube, guess what? We have the data now. They were all correct. They're all correct.
Yeah, but it's like what you said, sorry John, but it's like what you said about the Swedish epidemiologists. What he said was, judge me at the end. And I think that's probably something we should kind of pin on our Twitter accounts, judge me at the end.
Well, we'll let our readers judge you at the end. Ivor Cummins, thank you very much for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you soon. Maybe we'll get you on with an adversary or somebody with the
adversary is good. I'd love it. I haven't had enough of that. Well, yeah.
It was a bit soft today, was it? Okay. Thanks a lot, Ivor.
Thanks, guys. Good luck.
Thank you.
Have a great one.
Bye everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks all the Broadsheet readers. Thank you.